Oh.
All right, should we go ahead and get started? Great, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming and joining this Getting Plurality Public Research Workshop. This workshop has a fun format where it's expected that you've read or at least looked over the paper beforehand, so that most of the time that we have together is devoted to a discussion with our presenter. So our presenter today, we're thrilled to have him, is Ariel Procaccia, who's the Gordon McKay Professor of Computer Science at Harvard. He's one of the world's leading experts on computational social choice and has done many exciting things that try to combine the theory of social choice with practice in developing new democratic tools. So we're very excited to have him and have him tell us about his paper, which all of you have already read, and we'll have a discussion after. So just procedurally, Ariel will give an overview, remind you all of the main ideas of this paper for about 10 minutes. Then Divya, our wonderful commentator, who I can introduce just before she takes the mic, will respond for 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have a moderated discussion with the rest of the group. So hold on to your questions because everyone should have a chance to weigh in. All right, with that, I'll hand it over to Ariel.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm really thrilled to be here. So yeah, I'll talk for 10, 12 minutes maybe about just to give an overview from my viewpoint of the paper, which, like Zoe said, hopefully many of you have had a chance to look at. So you'll see the slides that I have quite a bit of AI-generated images in them, like this one. They might be a bit spooky, but I think that's a feature, right? Because we're also thinking about some of the dangers of these approaches, so that's appropriate. But hopefully we'll also be kind of convinced that there are some interesting opportunities and potential here as well. So this is joint work with Sarah, Paul, David, Gilly, Ty, and Manuel. All of us are at Harvard except Paul, who was at Harvard when we did this work, is going to join Cornell pretty soon. Okay, so I'd like to start with a story that you may have seen in the paper, which is kind of thinking about Brexit. So if we go back to 2016, the UK was facing various problems and some people were worried. And that led to this referendum where there were two options available to voters. One was to leave the European Union, and one was to stay in the European Union, basically change nothing, so just decline to make any changes. But of course, these are just two very specific options, and one can imagine many other policies that might help, right, and might have more consensus. So, just to give a few random examples, you might think about ditching British cuisine for French cuisine, which personally I think would be a pretty good move. You might think about relocating the royal family to California, and there are many other options that one could contemplate. And the question is, if we think about open-ended decisions like this, where there are many possible policies or bills that one can adopt, how do we go about designing processes, democratic processes that are able to handle this huge outcome space? So the high-level argument is that large language models can help with this. And in particular, there are two challenges that classical social choice theory faces that we need to address. So the first is unforeseen alternatives. In classical social choice, we typically have a predetermined small set of alternatives that people are voting over, expressing their preferences over, and we're choosing among these alternatives. And we're thinking about these cases where we want to consider a much larger set of alternatives that are not predetermined. So this is where LLMs come in. LLMs can potentially generate new alternatives that, like I said, could be better or have more consensus than a few predetermined alternatives. The second challenge, which is closely related, is unknown preferences. So in classical social choice, when you have the small predetermined set of alternatives, people typically express their preferences explicitly over those alternatives. So you might have, people saying what's their favorite alternative, like in plurality. You might have people ranking the alternatives, like in ranked choice voting. People giving scores, many other ways to express preferences. But these are all explicit ways of expressing preferences. When we have this huge set of potentially unforeseen alternatives, we can't ask people to explicitly state their preferences. So this is again where LLMs come in. The idea is that they can take input from people in the form of, just text that expresses people's opinions or values or priorities, and extrapolate from that text their preferences over unforeseen alternatives. So, so the high-level idea is LLMs can help in this way, but this combination of LLMs and social choice is a bit awkward, because social choice theory, the way I usually think about it, is a very mathematical area that thinks about kind of rigorously and mathematically analyzing democratic processes. LLMs are notoriously impervious to theoretical analysis. So the question is, how do we combine these two things? And that's where this framework of generative social choice comes in. So I basically think of it as a two-step framework, where step one is designing democratic processes that can give theoretical, rigorous guarantees, assuming we have access to perfect answers to certain queries. So in this step, we assume that an LLM can give us perfect answers to certain queries, and we use these queries as building blocks in democratic process that provably satisfies some guarantees. Now, the second step is empirical validation. So here we're recognizing that LLMs will not be able to perfectly answer our queries. And then the idea is to show empirically that the LLMs can give reasonably reliable answers to the queries. And in a sense, this approach is future-proof because right now, if we can show that GPT-4 gives us pretty good answers to the queries, the hope is that GPT-5 and then 6 will give even better answers to the queries. So this kind of process can only improve over time. And the goal is right now to show that it's plausible. So in the paper, we focus on a specific type of democratic process where the input is survey responses of N participants, where they express their opinions and vote over some example statements. The output is not a single policy or a single decision. It's a provably representative slate of case statements. So we want a slate of statements that represents different facets of the opinion of the opinions of the participants and kind of highlights these different aspects of the issue. So in the paper, we define formally what we mean by provably representative. Hopefully some of you have had a chance to take a look, this notion of balanced justified representation, but I won't go into it in this short presentation. So then behind the scenes, we have this algorithm that's running and transforming the input into the output. And the algorithm is interfacing with this oracle, which gives us, in theory, perfect answers to the queries. So again, in the paper, we describe the algorithm. I won't get into it. Let me just briefly remind you what the queries are. So we're using two types of queries. The first is a discriminative query, where the input is an agent represented by their survey response and a textual statement. And the output is the given agent's level of satisfaction for the given statement. In our implementation, we use a 5-point scale for satisfaction. So the question is whether the agent opinion is perfectly represented by the statement, mostly, somewhat, poorly, or not at all. And then the other query is a generative query that takes as input a subset of agents represented by their survey responses and an integer R. And here the output is a bit more technical. It's a statement that maximizes the R highest level of satisfaction among the members of the given group. This is a subset, a group of the given participants. So what does that mean? If we take R to be 10, for example, then you can imagine for every statement ordering the participants by their level of satisfaction. And then we look at the 10th most satisfied participant. And we want the statement that maximizes the satisfaction of the 10th most satisfied participant. For R equals 10, and you can plug any other value of R that you want. Okay, so yeah, I'm giving you a warning here about the disturbing image because, as you can see, I'm very particular about graphics, and I'm not a fan of these graphics. So this is a screenshot from this OpenAI program called Democratic Inputs to AI. And the goal of this program, which I think is a very, very exciting program, was to get teams to suggest innovative democratic processes specifically for AI alignment, so getting democratic inputs and distilling from them input to designers of AI, especially LLMs and generative AI. And one thing is that even though that was the initial goal, the democratic processes that were designed as part of this, I think, weren't specific to AI alignment, but they're more, just innovative ideas that can be used more broadly. So we were one of the teams that participated in this program. And as part of the program, we piloted the approach on a specific question of AI alignment. It was, the question was, to what degree should LLMs be personalized to individual users? So in the pilot, we had two stages. The first generation stage had N participants for N equals 100 in our pilot. And they were US, people who reside in the US, stratified over age, gender, and ethnicity to match the US population. We then asked these people, a survey, and we got responses, their opinions, their votes on some example statements. And then we used our democratic process, the algorithm, to get a slate of K statements for K equals 5. So we generated 5 statements. It was the output of the process. But then the goal was to verify that this output is really representative of the opinions of the population. So what we did for validation was we recruited a new sample of N participants, again, for N equals 100. And we asked these participants to rate the statements generated in the previous step. So it's again on the first 5-point scale. And then for every participant, we get ratings for all of the 5 statements. And then finally, what we do is we match the participants to the statements in a balanced way. So in our example, with 5 statements and 100 participants, we want every statement to be matched with 20 participants, right? So that would give us a balanced matching. And of the balanced matchings, we want the one that maximizes overall satisfaction, such that the sum of satisfaction scores is as high as possible. So that was kind of how we, we're kind of thinking about which statement represents which individual, again, imposing this balance constraint, which matches, work from the 90s by Monroe, for example. And then finally, we checked, so how satisfied are the participants in the validation stage by their match statements? And the results were that 75% of them, so 75 out of 100, felt they were perfectly represented by the matched statements. Another 18% were mostly represented, so 93% overall were perfectly or mostly represented. And then the other 7%, 6 of them were somewhat, so still not bad, but the other 7, a qualitative analysis shows that they're a bit of outliers, so they would be a bit harder to capture with representative statements. So overall, we felt these were encouraging results for the pilot that showed people do feel represented even in this sample, this fresh sample from the population. Okay, so to conclude, just to say a few obvious things. So, generative AI offers new building blocks for democracy, but AI-based democratic processes can be dangerous. For example, Bruce, who's here, has written quite a bit about the dangers of AI for democracy. So, we're all aware of various issues like fairness, transparency, accountability, adversarial attacks on the AI, and so on. And all of these can obviously lead to big issues, especially if you incorporate them into a kind of high-stakes democratic process. So I think that the good news potentially is that social choice, by giving this rigorous perspective and allowing us to give rigorous guarantees, it to some degree might help alleviate some of these concerns. and therefore unlock AI's potential for democratic innovation, or at least take a first step in that direction. That said, I think there are many, many issues. Like obviously, this is very early days. And I think there are many questions that I hope we can discuss around when we want to apply this kind of techniques, when do we see this process as being legitimate, how do we evaluate these techniques, do we find the validation that we did in the process to be satisfactory, and so on and on. So I think there's a lot to discuss. Finally, let me say that I'm obviously a computer scientist. I'm a professor of computer science, but also all of my training is in computer science. I did my undergrad in math and computer science, my PhD in computer science. So I've been interested in computational social choice for a long time, and also in democratic applications for the last couple of years. I've been teaching at Harvard a course called Optimized Democracy, and I've worked on some deployed applications in this area. But I still feel like I'm very much a novice in terms of things like political theory, political philosophy, and kind of the political science literature more generally. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you and learning from you.
Great. Thank you so much for that overview. That's super helpful. And we're excited to be able to provide this interdisciplinary forum. So we'll hand it over to Divya Siddharth now, who will give a brief response before we open up the broader discussion, at which point everyone will have a chance to offer comments and questions. Divya is, I don't even know how to give a bio because she's just absolutely brilliant and amazing. Most excitingly, she's the co-founder of the Collective Intelligence Project, which is a project that aims to think about how to better govern our intelligence and direct it toward a democratic sort of representation. So she's a great person to comment on this paper. Take it away, Divya.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Thank you, Ariel. This is a fascinating paper. As I run an organization called the Collective Intelligence Project, it would be remiss of me to talk a lot. I think a lot of this is about having a discussion and bringing everyone's viewpoints up. And Ariel did such a perfect job, unsurprisingly, summarizing the paper that I just want to kind of provide a couple of questions that were on my mind. Starting, I guess, from the most straightforward and down to the kind of most future-looking. So at a very kind of practical level, I was just really curious if you mentioned prompt injection attacks early on, and I think this is a problem that we've seen in a lot, basically any LLM-based application that we want to use in a high risk or meaningful context at all, that this could be kind of a major difficulty or blocker that doesn't seem to have, that many technical solutions yet. And I think there may be, in some ways, quote unquote, collective intelligence solutions to this. Like potentially you could have people checking each other's statements in some kind of way to mitigate against this. And because it is an instance in which technical solutions are difficult, but more kind of collective intelligence type solutions are possible, I was just curious if you had thought about that direction of mitigating against prompt injection attacks, and generally any other just on the process level kind of vulnerabilities that you've noticed and have been concerned about in this process. So I think that it's somewhat of a straightforward question, but I think it's really interesting because, and Bruce has actually done great work on this as well, how do we take the open-endedness of LLMs, take all of the good of it, and then try to mitigate against the kind of obvious risks that introduces? The second topic I was particularly interested in discussing was around representativeness. And so, this paper has a very particular approach to what it means to create a representative set of statements. I'm wondering if you can explain more how that kind of idea of representation came about, to what extent you think there are other ways we could imagine a representative set of statements being generated from, one big set of end statements leads to one smaller set of K statements. What other functions could that mapping create? And can you say more about the ways that you've defined representation here, which is kind of to take this population test out of sample? What are other ways we could test whether this is actually a representative set of statements? And I think generally, because this paper hinges so much on that, mapping between the initial set of statements and the representative set of statements, would be good to piece apart the different kinds of representation that are brought up here. And then we get into some of the more, as you mentioned, kind of political theory and democracy questions. And so I found it interesting. I think you note in the conclusion as well that this is only an input into what it might look like to run a democratic process, right? So democracy, likely has to involve some amount of power over decision making, likely some potentially deliberation. Open-ended options are good, but different notions of representation, et cetera. There's a lot that goes into a democratic process, and I was curious how you were imagining this fitting into a democratic process. At what stage of a democratic process do you imagine generative social choice kind of coming up? And what would it mean to have an end-to-end legitimate process around generative social choice? You sort of mentioned one of the major concerns might be participants wouldn't trust this process, and there is some intransparency inherent to some measures of using language models. Curious if you've thought about ways to mitigate that, or if this is a necessary component of scaling democracy. So at CIP, we've thought a lot about what it looks like to quote unquote scale democratic processes. I think a bunch of folks here have worked on, can you mitigate this nuanced scale trade-off somehow through the use of generative AI, where currently it's very difficult to elicit very granular, nuanced statements from people at scale. And so you can have like representative citizens assemblies, long in-person deliberation, very nuanced conversations, very small number of people, or you can have like nation state voting, large numbers of people, very non-granular information. Can we like mitigate that dichotomy somehow? And to my view, this is kind of moving in that direction, but it's still early, as you say, in terms of trying to actually build a democratic process out of it. So I think it would be interesting to think about the legitimacy and democratic components. And then the final question is, extrapolation. Let's say this is actually the perfect process, and we actually can perfectly represent some kind of mean of end statements or population's views through this condensed set of case statements. What does that mean? Like, in what context do you think this is most useful? And what would that mean for the future of how we are thinking about decision making if this problem is in some sense solved? And also, are there downsides to that? Are there concerns that you see on the kinds of people that might run these processes, the kinds of institutions that might benefit from this, et cetera, and ways to mitigate that? So I think that's a lot already, and there's a lot in the paper already. I can just put a link to this in the chat if folks want to look at the questions so that we don't have to all stare at a slide instead of each other's beautiful faces. But thank you so much for this, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks so much, Divya. Ariel, do you want to begin with a at least somewhat preliminary response to some of Divya's remarks, and then we can go on to a broader let others bring up their own points. As we move into the general discussion, I just have a few procedural points, which is it's now that we're all talking to each other, it would be great if you could keep your camera on if possible. And if you want to ask a question, raise your hand in the chat and I'll call on people in the queue.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. So, and thanks, Divya, for the very interesting thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts in response. I'll try to keep it short to let other people speak, because I'm very interested to hear what people think. So the first point you raised, Divya, was kind of the prompt injection attacks and kind of adversarial attacks on this process. So I think there are, so one part of the answer is that it's kind of, it's the role of LLM developers. LLM developers are working to address these concerns, right? And I think as LLMs do a better job of addressing things like prompt injection attacks, then obviously that will be mitigated also for processes relying on LLMs. But I think there are also ways in which we can make the process more interactive. And I think you mentioned something like this, Divya, in a different context. Make the process more interactive to have more verification and make sure that bad things don't happen. So to give you like one example that I had in mind, imagine a multi-step process that instead of having one kind of generation stage and one validation stage, has multiple stages where we have a first group of people that generates a slate of statements. Then we have a second group coming in and they look at the first slate and they're like, okay, these 3 statements are bad, let's throw them out, but let's keep the other 2 and generate 3 new statements. And then a new group comes in and says, oh, in the previous slate, 2 statements are bad, let's throw them out. So you can imagine an iterative process like this that refines the slate over time, and then would be much more robust to any kind of particular things going wrong in the process. So the second question that I can talk about a lot is representation, kind of how we got to this notion of representation and so on. So in the interest of keeping things short, I'll maybe give one particular viewpoint about how we got there. So we had earlier work that started from Polis, which is a system that hopefully many of you have heard about. It's been an inspiration for our work. So it's a system that takes as input people's comments about some topic and shows people each other's comments. They get to vote and then aggregates these votes and shows kind of the public opinion in different ways. But I've kind of long thought of Polis as also a system that basically tries to distill a representative set of opinions. So they have this thing where for different clusters of people, they highlight different statements. They have the most popular statements. So I think of it as also the main purpose is just distilling a representative slate of statements. And my viewpoint on that for a couple of years has been, if we have these predetermined statements, we can think of the statements as candidates in a kind of election. And what we basically want to do is select a committee. And once we think about it in that way, like selecting a committee of representatives from these statements that are the candidates, then we can leverage a bunch of literature in computational social choice that thinks about representation axioms for committee elections based on approval votes. Like people say, I like the statement, I don't like the statement, and we want to select a committee. So that's how we approach this, kind of thinking about this as a committee election problem. And then we can leverage these nice axioms that are of this justified representation family. So our axiom is one variant of this, but there are various other variants. I think what's really special about these axioms, in contrast to other things in social choice, is that they help explain solutions. So for those of you who are familiar with social choice, often the axioms people think about are things like monotonicity of the voting rule, consistency. All of these axioms are things that either don't apply in every situation or kind of counterfactual. And I hope this makes sense, but these justified representation notions are things where for every outcome, you can say, here's why this outcome was chosen. If you want to complain about the outcome, here's my answer to that complaint in a sense. So it's a very powerful kind of family of axioms that really is, I think, has this unusual property of being able to explain solutions. That's on a very high level. Then the next question was how this fits into a democratic process. So so I guess like when we use the term democratic process in the paper, we do think of this as the democratic process instead of a component to a larger process. Right, so if the goal of the process, like in Polis, is we get inputs and we output a slate of representative opinions in a sense, then that's one way to think of this as the entire process. That said, of course, it can also be a component in a larger process. So to give one example, I've done quite a bit of work on citizens' assemblies, and I've had some discussions with practitioners in the citizen assembly space about using this potentially as an initial input to a citizens' assembly. So at the stage where they're being informed about the question at hand, the idea is maybe we can give the output of a generative social choice-based process as kind of another input to the assembly representing what the population thinks and those different aspects in a concise way. So that could be one example where this is just a component in like a bigger and well-established process. And that would also alleviate some of the concerns about the dangers, right? Because it's only one piece of information among many that plays a role as input to an assembly. And then the next question was this scaling democracy kind of, I guess that was like one point you raised, Divya, as part of like one of the points. I just want to highlight it as a really interesting point, this trade-off of legitimacy and scale. So it's also something where we thought about as well, where, I really like citizen assemblies, but I feel like they're kind of one point of the Pareto frontier, which does pretty badly in terms of scale. It's very difficult to scale it up, but are very powerful in terms of things like legitimacy. On the other hand, a process like generative social choice can potentially scale to many people, and like participation could be very high, but would really suffer from legitimacy. And then there's a trade-off there where if you have, for example, more stages, like I said, in a more interactive process, then that's a different point on the trade-off where you have potentially smaller scale, but more legitimacy. Yeah, and the final point was like extrapolation. That my thoughts on that are pretty vague, so maybe I'll leave that to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. It looks like we have two questions. Let's start with Luke, and then we'll go to Bruce.
Thanks, Zoe, and thanks, Ariel, for the paper. It's really cool work. My question is about just pressing a bit more on the definition of justified representation used, and some of the subparts of this question is just potentially just clarifications for my benefit. But I just wanted to start clarify the definition of coalition is the assumption that the space is sort of partitioned into a set of disjoint coalitions. And if so, do you foresee some limitations with that in the sort of open-ended domains in which or it's used here, there might be a sort of complex set of overlapping groups who agree on different statements and overlap in different ways. And so yeah, there's that sort of concern.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just quickly respond to that
Sure.
point, because it might inform the next point. I'm glad you brought it up, because it's a very important clarification. It's a big source of the power of these justified representation approaches, in that there is no assumption on what the coalitions are. So the definition is that for every coalition that is large enough to deserve a seat on the slate, like a statement on the slate. So of size n over k, where n is the number of participants, k is the number of statements on the slate. Right? So if you're of size n over k, you're large enough to deserve a statement. And they're cohesive, intuitively, they're cohesive in terms of their preferences. So that's kind of the intuition. But the definition applies to any such coalition. So there's no predetermined, disjoint coalitions or anything like that. Any group of voters that come together and say, we kind of agree on some statement and we deserve representation on the slate, we should be represented, they have a guarantee. So the definition actually really nicely addresses that concern, and that it's not an issue. Like there's no assumption on some partition into groups.
Okay, cool. That's helpful. And then the sort of part two was, I'm sort of largely basing this off your sort of the qualitative version of the definition you give in the paper, but it sounds like a coalition is considered to be represented or not ignored if you say at least one member must be assigned to a statement with utility above a given threshold, and that threshold is the same as the threshold that sort of characterizes the cohesiveness of the group. Mm. But is that statement necessarily the same statement which makes the group cohesive, or is it just is it a different statement? Because I can imagine maybe I'm a member of a group, we're cohesive on one statement, but then I'm considered to be, well, the group is considered to be represented because I'm represented on another statement, which is not, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a real weakness of the definition, and this just comes from mathematical necessity. So the question is kind of what's the strongest type of guarantee you can give that will provably be feasible in every situation. So what you're saying is I would want a guarantee that says, representation of the group means that all of them are getting utility at least as high as this guarantee. So if they can agree on some statement that where they all have utility, they feel mostly represented, then all of them should feel mostly represented by the slate of statements. That would be the ideal thing, but that's just infeasible. So you can kind of construct examples where that wouldn't be possible, and then the kind of what we have to do to give mathematical guarantees is relax the definition in order to be able to do something that's provably fair. So in that sense, that is a real weakness of the definition. But then, of course, the question is, okay, this is a worst case guarantee, something that is guaranteed to every coalition in every situation. The hope is that if we design a reasonable process that in particular satisfies that guarantee, in practice, you would have much better representation. And I think that's what we're seeing anecdotally with the pilots that we ran.
Okay.
Great, thanks. Let's go to Bruce then.
Hey there. So I want to be a little science fiction-y with you. I think it's really interesting. So I'm thinking about whether it's possible to have avatars like this actually debate legislation. So my idea is, instead of representation, we each have a personal avatar. They go into a virtual room, and a million of them debate, discuss, eventually agree on legislative language. So speculate with me.
Yeah. So are you asking, does current technology support that?
No, we know current does. Do you think your idea can be pushed that far?
I think it can. So if we assume that that we are able that your avatar can really represent your preferences, and we're able to, at least in terms of the processes that give the kind of guarantees that we want, right? All they need is to be able to say we can accurately predict people's preferences and work with those predicted preferences. What you're saying is we have a more complicated process where we deliberated and kind of, and that makes, one issue with that is people's preferences change over time as well. So I think a crucial aspect that you'd want to capture in that kind of thing is not only to predict people's preferences before any deliberation happens, but also how their preferences change as deliberation happens. So I feel like that would be the key challenge. But as long as you can do that, I feel like the same framework would apply, like the same ideas would potentially apply.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Great. So let's go to whoever's in that room. Is it Uma and Glenn?
Yeah. Hey.
Hey, Glenn.
And what room are you in? I couldn't find you.
202.
Oh, there's a bunch of other people in that room when I looked. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Come join us first.
Yeah, I'm down the hall. All right, I'll be there in a second.
So I guess my question is going to be a little bit in the spirit of Bruce, sort of like a call for reflection more than like a pointed question. But so one modality of providing feedback as individuals that then gets processed through some LLM into some kind of representative thing is rankings or up-down votes. Another feedback would be the provision of a scalar, number. And I have worked, quite a bit on that problem. Another form of feedback would be the provision of some kind of structured communication, like, evaluation and certain qualitative criteria of what you think of these different statements along different dimensions that might be relevant. Another format would be a natural language reaction to the set of statements or to the statements individually. Another reaction would be the capturing of a video of you experiencing the statements and the affect that it elicits in you, and possibly in some sequencing, and you could imagine even richer interactions. You could imagine seeing someone experience someone saying that to them in a virtual reality world and seeing their effective, interaction with that, or et cetera. And I guess like a question in my mind is like how you think about the trade-offs between having an agent that effectively is training on or reacting to or auto-completing or whatever based on these different modalities of feedback that could be provided to the system. And obviously certain types of axioms are going to be better suited to describe what it would mean to have good reaction to this, and some reactions to this like won't even be well describable by concisely stated mathematical axioms. Some of them will themselves be black boxes or something like that. And there's of course then also trade-offs in terms of like the richness, the legitimacy, or whatever. Anyways, it just seems like an interesting thing to reflect upon. So
yeah, so that's a really interesting point, and I think there are two different dimensions to the question. You might be thinking about both dimensions simultaneously, but let me try to kind of separate them. So one is the way in which, if you think about these surveys that we gave the participants in the pilot, right? So one is like, how do we get the input of participants from which we will extrapolate their preferences over new and unknown statements. And in the surveys, so we ask people for a kind of free-form text opinion, but we also asked them to rate some example statements numerically, right? So you mentioned like kind of numerical scores as one of the input modalities, like that is something that we also use in the surveys. You know, we could also ask them to rank these different example statements and so on. To be honest, like we didn't consider this too carefully because, you know, the idea was let's gather enough information from the participants so that we're able to accurately predict their preferences. And once we saw that we were able to accurately predict their preferences over new statements, we were like, this is good enough, right? So what we did, which was give me some numerical ratings, give me a free-form text, is good enough for now. It's very possible that if you gather more information in different ways, you're able to more accurately predict people's preferences. So, you know, I don't know, but that's definitely possible.
Sorry, Ariel, sorry. Let me just push you a little bit on this. I think there's like a little bit something. I want a little bit of back and forth, you know, on this stuff. I think that's a little bit simplistic because the thing is that when you say preference, what you mean is some input modality that you're calling preference. Like, I give it a high score or not, right? But like that's made up. I mean, like these are all just abstractions, right? Like the way that people, like you're forcing someone to give a reaction in that format to this thing. And like that's taking some reflection, but like the actual data of their reaction to the statement is like the full set of things that occurs to their body. You know, in the time following the statement being presented to them and like over whatever period you're able to observe it. So that's a massively higher dimensional set of things that in theory you could take as a target for prediction than is you force them to give this, I mean, and like that's not even taking into account the fact that like you're forcing the things to be a statement in the first place. Like in natural language, in a written natural language, not in an oral, like, anyways, there's just like so much to this problem beyond like, we're going to predict their preferences well, and we're going to put some axioms on that. And like, I understand that you've chosen to project it onto them. That like, that's fine. I don't think that's a bad choice, but I just think it's worth reflecting on like how that choice was made.
Yeah, you know, absolutely. So that's kind of the second dimension I had in mind. I wasn't sure which dimension you were referring to. So apparently you're kind of thinking about the second dimension. So like the way I wanted to separate it is one dimension is this: how do you collect input in order to predict preferences? The second dimension is exactly what you said, which is what is the format of the preferences that you're predicting? And so here, you know, I think you're making a great point. So, and I have a couple of thoughts about it. So where we started was this, as I mentioned, kind of the history of this is we started by thinking about polis. And in polis, people basically just upvote or downvote you know, statements made by others. So our starting point in the previous paper was, okay, we can think of these as approval votes. And then when we kind of started this work, we were like, okay, let's expand on this. Think about people's preferences are approval votes. We want to predict those approval votes and give axioms with respect to approval votes. And we kind of worked in that framework for a couple of months, and it didn't seem satisfying in that, you know, it's kind of you basically are trying to get the LM to predict, would this person support the statement or not? It doesn't seem fine-grained enough. So ultimately, we actually around, you know, after midway, we switched to this more nuanced setting with a 5-point scale in terms of the preferences. And we had to redo some of the theory as well, like how are the guarantees defined with respect to this finer scale. And that seemed to be much more satisfying. Now, you're absolutely right that there are many, many other options. So that's how we got to working with this particular option. Like that was the process that led us to working with these kind of numerical scores. You know, so let's take one of the other options you mentioned, which is rankings, right? So let's say that we wanted to predict people's rankings over the different, you know, different statements. Notice that one complication is there's arguably an infinite set of statements or you know, there's some mathematical difficulties with thinking about rankings. But if you did want to say people's preferences are presented as rankings and we want to work with those, then there are also axioms like proportionality for solid coalitions that would allow you to think about representation in that context. So as long as you're in the world of rankings, there's also some mathematical tools you can use. Once you go beyond that, it's a super interesting thought. It's very hard for me to think about the trade-off, like, especially like the more kind of radical, as you mentioned, like the reaction. How does a person react to a video of a statement being read or something? It's super interesting, but it's something that seems both difficult to work. I guess my more concrete reaction is it seems we wanted to give mathematical guarantees, right? So we have to work with the more simpler kind of formats.
But I guess that's exactly what I'm trying to press you on a little bit. It's like, should we want to work with that? Like, to me, look, there's a lot I love about the paper. I think it's great, and I seriously think you guys have advanced tremendously democratic practice. I'm like, it's awesome work. I'm a super fan. When I see what do I not like about the paper? It's like there seems to be an implicit assumption that like stuff that we can sort of mathematically characterize because it has these like really dorky sort of like, structure to it that we then impose on people is like what we should focus on rather than something that like takes advantage of the full power of the LLM, which is that it can like do all kinds of like really gooey stuff. And like, what's the trade-off there? Like, well, how do you think about that? You know what I mean? Because it seems like it's throwing away a lot of the power here, but of course it's getting some kind of quote transparency, unquote for that. But like transparency really to like super geeks like us, which like, is that good or not? I mean, I don't know. You know what I mean?
Right. So yeah, okay, it's a great point. I have a lot to say about this. So again, I'll try to make this brief. But I'll give you an example from experience with fair division. So we've done a lot of applied work in fair division. We had this website that has been online for 8 years, and we're trying to revive now, called Split It, that gives provably fair solutions to kind of everyday problems like dividing rent and so on. And there, again, the idea was we explain to people what the fairness guarantees are. So this is not to geeks; these are to everyday users, and we had around 300,000 users. We explain to them what the guarantees are. And when they get the solution, we explain to them why it satisfies the advertised fairness guarantees. And there are studies showing that people really react to that. So they do view the process as more trustworthy and legitimate because you give them these provable guarantees. I think, my hope is that the same thing would happen here, where because of this axioms that can explain solutions kind of thing, it's not just for geeks, but even for people, activists, to say, why was I not represented in the outcome? You'd be like, here, I explained what the fairness guarantee is, and here's why your group did not, garner enough support to get represented according to this kind of guarantee. So I feel like these things, they're not as crisp as in fair division, but this kind of axiom is something that really addresses not only geeks and experts, but also everyday people who use these things.
So I think that's a good answer. And I think that is what I would love to see in the next iteration of this work, you actually being serious about quantifying and like putting down on and showing that the other modality, like tracing out that frontier of like, what do you give up in legitimacy for, like richness of interaction modality or something like that.
Yeah. Very
well, that was a very productive back and forth. Thanks, Glenn, and thanks, Ariel, for your responses. Let's get a few more voices in. So Andy, do you want to go ahead, and then Jian?
Yeah, thank you on this. I would go slightly into the direction of Glenn, but here maybe nudge you into maybe a modality that can defend the text, so the text operations here and stay in that approach, because when I'm thinking about any type of output of some technological artifact, there is a use of that technological artifact downstream. And here, one concrete thing is, if we have summaries from many people, politicians are going to read them. So I'm wondering, in the paper, this is ultimately choose a small number of statements. You were giving the Brexit example as, we are going to actually then have a downstream election based on that. Or we are going to have a legislative assistant or a legislative director of an office read that and take an action. Yeah, can you be a bit more explicit about what is actually the use of the artifact that you're envisioning, because I think you have alluded to several of them, and then follow up on that. If you have this downstream use of the artifact, can that inform actually what's going on? Because I think there are many ways where actually text summarization and not the more general things that Glenn talked about are actually, you can resuscitate them if you're pretty consequentialist and just say, okay, what's really the use of this is this artifact in deployment?
Yeah, very good. So yes, I want to draw a distinction between the generative social choice framework and the initial Brexit example and our actual instantiation of it in the paper. So in the general framework, and when I was thinking about the Brexit example, you could think about a process that takes people's free-form text opinions and generates a policy for the UK, or if we think about LLM alignment, like a policy for LLM design, that is then just the decision of kind of the democratic output, the decision of the population. So in Brexit, you can imagine this radical situation where people just say, here's my opinion in text, and then the generative social choice process says, here's the policy the UK will take. So in terms of like the framework itself, it supports that kind of thing.
Let me nudge you there, though.
Yeah.
Even if you have an output statement, there is still going to be a translation step into policy of that. I think you cannot really get out of that. That the direct performativity of the LLM statement won't be possible because it is not yet law. There's always
right. I mean, yeah. So you can imagine like the more radical situation where the LLM is actually able to generate a full-fledged policy. So it seems very far-fetched right now in terms of legitimacy and current technology, but you can definitely imagine that, right? So it's not that the generative social choice framework would potentially support something like that. Right? You could think about a full-fledged policy, extrapolate people's preferences if they understood all of the details of the law about that
all
policy.
our judges are AIs, then also.
Exactly. So it's getting less and less legitimate, more and more far-fetched, but it's not like the framework definitely extends to that kind of thing. So it's not not a limitation of the statement that we're of the framework that we're outputting a slate of statements. Then the second thing is, okay, for the thing we've already implemented, what are the uses of that? So I do think of it as informing deliberation by politicians or informing some kind of process downstream. So you can, for example, I think a really good example to keep in mind is Polis, because Polis essentially does the same thing, right? It basically summarizes the discussion people had, and then you can look. Actually, I can give you the link. So if you look at like this link, they have like various case studies. And it's all of these are kind of good examples for what having a representative slate would lead to. So, for example, like one of the famous use cases was ride-sharing policy in Taiwan, kind of discussing that, and that was input to politicians. So, kind of understanding what people think as input to then legislation that happened after. So, like I said, summarizing public opinion for politicians and highlighting like all of the most salient aspects is one use. If you think about AI alignment, here the consumers are people in companies like OpenAI and Google and so on who are designing their large language models. So that would be input to engineers and executives and so on in terms of understanding what people want.
Which there, and this is the last thing I said, we can move on, which then I think begs this question. What are the preferences are probably over the outcomes of that process. What is the final aligned LLM as a result of the statements? Is it possible to actually understand preferences that's form? And then if you write down any consistency condition about utility, is this micro-foundable through what downstream effects actually the statements have?
Yeah, so that's it's a great point, which I thought about quite a bit in the context of citizens' assemblies. So I'll just like briefly react. I think we don't know how to answer this in the context of any democratic process. And so, to kind of illustrate how general this is, think about citizens' assemblies. And, like there are many design decisions one makes in a citizen assembly, so like which features to stratify over when we're choosing the assembly, many things like that. And I want to know, how do these different design decisions affect the quality of the outcome at the other end? I have no idea how to answer this question. And I think, that's kind of a broad family of questions I have also about generative social choice, but in general, how do we do this quantification? So I don't know how to answer it in any context, and in particular in the context of generative social choice. But if people have like any thoughts about this, I would be very glad to hear.
Yeah, thanks so much. So let's go to Jian, and then we'll hear from Doug.
Thank you, Professor. I'm so excited that you have this tool. Let me give you an example how to use your tool. I believe this could be a very useful tool for C-suite prediction. Any strategy that if you predict a strategy, you want to test it, and this is a great tool, I believe. And then you could, I am very impressive that you thought about the decision changing by the time. So you can pull like multiple times, multiple sessions that in order to edit your decision or adjust your decision in order for your decision to fit perfectly with your peers. So that is one. My question for you is that how practical that you could adapt, connect to the larger database, for example, machine learning or AI, and then how adaptable that you could use the social media. Any kind of, another question for you is, what was your security guarding mechanism that easy or not easy to directly connect to? Thank you.
Okay, great. So there are a couple of different questions here. One note about like the application, which it's a very nice idea, the kind of C-suite application. I'll say that this is something, so there's another system similar to Polis called Remesh that uses kind of more AI, has bigger AI components in it. And that, so Polis is a kind of non-profit, the Computational Democracy Project. Remesh is a commercial company, which was actually founded by a guy called Andrew Konya, who was very interested in kind of settling disputes around the world. So they have like a very big kind of pro bono component, but to make money and develop the system, they work with companies exactly for the kind of applications that you talked about. So that's a very insightful comment. And
do you have
Remesh,
a link of it?
yeah, it's I think remesh.com.
Very common. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, let me. I'll post a link later, but
Okay.
I think it's remesh.com, remesh.com, I believe. So yeah, so that's a great idea and already kind of in use for this kind of system. Then you're asking about kind of tapping into existing databases in social media.
Right.
So yeah, I think there are different ways to interpret that. One way I would interpret it is saying we already have information from social media, for example, about what people think. So then we don't need to actually ask them a survey. We can kind of scrape their data from social media, or if they share it with us, that will replace the survey response. And then we can use that to extrapolate their preferences and so on. I'll look close to the link. It's remesh.ai, not .com. Right, so the idea would be we kind of get people's opinions from their social media posts and then extrapolate from that. I mean, I think that's, assuming that's what you meant, I think that can be very directly done. So, essentially what we're saying right now is, here's like for our queries, we're saying here's the like survey responses of this person. Now kind of predict their opinion in a certain format. You might as well just paste like their social media posts and then ask the same thing. I don't know if the accuracy would be better or worse. It's worth checking, but I think it's a very natural idea. Like it's definitely something where you can avoid some of the effort of collecting preferences, and if people share with you that information, you might have a very detailed database of their opinion. So that's a really great idea. And then the final thing was about security. So I think it's the point that Divya also brought up in terms of, I mean, maybe I'm misinterpreting, but I think things like prompt injection and so on. So I briefly addressed this in the beginning, where my thoughts, which are incomplete, is that A, LLMs are becoming more resilient to this as developers are working to address this. And then B, like kind of thinking about these more interactive processes where even if you have attacks like this and you have security breaches, over time, you are able to fix them with people kind of, multiple stages of input where people fix different things that were off about the slate.
Thank you so much.
I just want to add that there's an interesting kind of connection here between what Glenn was talking about with the sort of differences in how people, what you're capturing when you ask someone to respond to the representative of a statement versus asking them to provide a statement. And those, that distinction is very interesting when it comes to the question that you raised about social media and what kinds of statements are you getting if you're just trawling the web versus actively asking people to provide a statement. So let's go to Doug.
Great, thank you. I really enjoyed the paper. I thought it was really, really well done and very interesting. I do see immediate application for policymakers in terms of polling, trying to get a better sense of where the electorate is, and especially if you can really do some understanding about what the most salient issues are, not just preferences within issues, but which are really going to matter the most to likely voters. And I do think that trying to scrape existing social media, sort of like you see on the Amazon review summaries that are popping up and some of the things on Twitter, I think is useful, but to overcome some of the challenges that have been present for several years in polling in terms of just response rates and skewed responses. I think that if you can find existing information, that's helpful. I'm curious. I feel like a lot of this group is probably has aims for this beyond simply polling and trying to take the temperature of the electorate in terms of actually translating preferences into policy change. And you've spoken about legitimacy, and I think that's a major component of this. I think the other component is the pathway, right? How do you move from an existing system into a theoretical future system? I'm curious if you've given thought to that. I'm a big fan of open primaries and ranked choice voting, and I've had a number of conversations with Senator Murkowski's political team, because that's pretty much the only way that she was able to survive in Alaska was through that mechanism. But it's very difficult to get existing policymakers who were put into power under the old system to acquiesce to a new system. I think term limits is kind of the classic example where they've been broadly popular with the public in both parties, and whether you believe in them or not, I mean, there's certainly something that is popular, but existing policymakers have zero interest in doing that for obvious reasons. So just curious, if your work touches on the sort of pathway question, and if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So I'll maybe mention like one more point about kind of the political opinion summarization. So there is already work using LLMs for summarizing public input. So for example, Nathan Sanders, who's worked with Bruce, for example, has been doing some work on that, where there's a platform for Massachusetts for people who want to submit input on legislation, so public input. So they created this platform where you can it automatically sends an email to your representative, but also kind of collects all of that data. And they've been exploring things like using LLMs in order to summarize that input in order to present it to politicians in a concise way. So that's, it doesn't have a, I would say like we're trying to do a bit more than summarization, right? Like the generation component of trying to find new things that would be kind of exciting to people. But certainly like things like that are already in the process of being deployed. Okay, but then you're asking kind of about the higher stakes kind of decisions, like actually getting it, to potentially even make decisions or like feed more directly into decision making. So, I don't have a clear path. I'll say again, like, some of my intuitions lately are coming for citizen assemblies because I've been very excited about that. It's something where I'll maybe just say, in case some of you haven't seen citizen assemblies, these are randomly selected groups of people who are basically convened by governments to to deliberate and inform them about important issues, right? And this has been happening on a very large scale in Europe, on a national scale as well, but hardly at all in the US, like in terms of policymakers actually standing behind assemblies and kind of committing to implementing their decisions. And I think the path there has been kind of trying to push for more and more experiments so people see that this is a powerful paradigm. And what we've seen in Europe is this happening more and more, kind of more at the local level than at the national level. And recently we've been seeing more and more permanent assemblies, which are kind of permanent institutions where the people are selected at random for a year and a half every time. And they have a legal mechanism for interacting with the parliament or the city council in some cases. So there are a couple of these examples in Europe now that I think came out of people seeing many assemblies take place with lower stakes and saying that this is a good and legitimate process. So, I mean, I think that's a good example, like, you know, starting out with smaller stakes things and working your way up from there. But it's, yeah, definitely a difficult path.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's do one more question from Maggie, and let's try to keep it brief because I want to leave just a few minutes at the end for everyone to write up a final question for Ariel and the group in the chat. So where did Maggie go? Oh, there's Maggie.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation, and thank you for the paper as well. I just noticed in the paper you briefly mentioned this applying both to opinion statements, but also potentially to value statements and things like that. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about your thinking there and like what that process might look like if it were different kinds of structures, for example, value statements. I know we've talked about other kinds of inputs, but yeah, I know you just mentioned that briefly, so curious if you could say more.
Yeah, so you're thinking about the case where the output would be value statements, right? Not the input. So I think I mentioned values in the context of the input, where people, so, you know, for example, if you talk about like a policy for a country, right, like our Brexit example, and you know, and you kind of say my value is protecting vulnerable people like refugees or migrants, right? That value can play a role into your preferences on policies. So that's kind of one, that's the way I had in mind in which values are taken into account. I think you're asking about a different thing, which is values where the output would be a set of values. Yeah, I mean, my first reaction is, it's not something I've thought about. My first reaction is that in theory, the same framework could work, right? Like so you want to say, here are the most important values people care about. I've actually seen this with Remesh. So we've been collaborating very recently on Israeli-Palestinian dialogues. And the first thing they're trying to do, they have this hierarchy of things they're trying to get out of the dialogues, but the first thing is just, what are the basic values everybody agrees on? And there are, you know, things that really like are pretty obvious, you know, like things like everybody should have security and so on. Of course, the difficult question is how you get there, but the values are pretty obvious. But that's exactly what they're trying to do. So they're trying to kind of, out of the discussion, get a set of values that everybody agrees on and are seen as the most salient values. You know, I think the generative social choice process can be used for this. I would say, like, my one caveat is that when you say this value like completely represents my opinion, or you know, that wouldn't be quite a good fit, because I think people's opinions consist of many values. It's hard to think about a statement consisting of like multiple values compounded together. So I feel like there would be some implementation details in how to get it to work, like what is the right way to rate, like, you know, even if we're sticking with ratings, what's the right way to rate values, like what's the right scale, what are we shooting for? But in principle, I feel like the framework should be applicable.
Thank you so much. This was such a great discussion. And we have just a few minutes left, which what we usually like to do with the final few minutes is for everyone to quietly reflect and take a moment to write down a question that you still have, and put that question in the chat. And that will give Ariel an even bigger bank of things to think about and things for all of us to reflect on in the future together as a group. So let's take a moment to do that. All right, well, we're at time, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thanks for offering all of your great insights, and thank you most of all to Ariel for bringing us this very thought-provoking and provocative paper. I found the discussion to be really provocative in ways that I wasn't expecting. And yeah, we're looking forward to continuing the discussion in various ways.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was both really fun and really useful. And yeah, special thanks to Zoe and Divya.
Great. Well, everyone take care, and we'll make sure that the comments from the chat get to you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.